Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. This is chapter 46 of Moby Dick, read by a real human. I am not against AI, but as of September 19th, 2025, AI narrators are still crap, right? There's not one that sounds very good. There's no soul, nor will there ever be. There's no breath of life, nor will there ever be. But at some point, they will get to the point that a good, it can mimic a good narrator, but they're not there yet. So, if you like to hear actual people read, that's where we do. That's what happens here. I read here. This is my recording session. Then I edit them and then put them back. I re-upload it onto the thing. So, if you like classic literature read by real humans in audiobook form, this is a place for you, my friend. All right, here we go. Now, this is called, this is from chapter 46, Surmises. Though consumed with the hot fire of his purpose, Ahab, in all his thoughts and actions, ever had in view the ultimate capture of Moby Dick, though he seemed ready to sacrifice all mortal interest to that one passion. Nevertheless, it may have been that he was by nature and long habitation far too wedded to a fiery whaleman's ways, although to abandon the collateral prosecution of the voyage. Altogether to abandon the collateral prosecution of the voyage. Or at least, if this were otherwise, there were not wanting other motives much more influential with him. It would be refining too much, perhaps even considering his monomania, to hint that his vindictiveness towards the white whale might have possibly extended himself in some degree to all sperm whales, and that the more monsters he slew, by so much the more he multiplied the chances that each subsequently encountered whale would prove to be the hated one he hunted. But if such an hypothesis be indeed exceptionable, there were still additional considerations which, though not so strictly according with the wildness of his ruling passion, yet were by no means incapable of swaying him. To accomplish his object, Ahab must use tools, and of all the tools used in the shadow of the moon, men are most apt to get out of the men, and of all tools used in the shadow of the moon, men are most apt to get out of order. He knew, for example, that however magnetic his ascendancy in some respects was over Starbuck, yet that ascendancy did not cover the complete spiritual man any more than mere corporeal superiority involves intellectual mastership. For to the purely spiritual, the intellectual but stand in sort of corporeal relation. Starbuck's body and Starbuck's coerced will were Ahab's, so long as Ahab kept his magnet at Starbuck's brain. Still, he knew that for all this, the chief mate in his soul abhorred his captain's quest, and could he would joyfully disintegrate himself from it, or even frustrate it. It might be that a long interval would elapse ere the white whale was seen. During that long interval, Starbuck would ever be apt to fall into open relapses of rebellion against his captain's leadership, unless some ordinary prudential, circumstantial influences were brought to bear upon him. Not only that, but the subtle insanity of Ahab respecting Moby Dick was no ways more significantly manifested than in this superlative sense and shrewdness in foreseeing that, for the present, the hunt should in some way be stripped of that strange imaginative impiousness which naturally invested it, that the full horror of the voyage must be kept withdrawn into the obscure background, for few men's courage is proof against protracted meditation unrelieved by action, that when they stood their long night watches, his officers and men must have some nearer things to think of than Moby Dick. For however eagerly and impetuously the savage crew had hailed the announcement of his quest, yet all sailors of all sorts are more or less capricious and unreliable. They live in the varying outer weather, and they inhale its fickleness, and when retained for any object remote and blank in the pursuit, however promissory of life and passion in the end, it is above all things requisite that temporary interests and employments should intervene and hold them healthily suspended for the final dash. Nor was Ahab unmindful of another thing. In times of strong emotion, mankind disdain all base considerations. But such times are evanescent. The permanent constitutional condition of the manufactured man, thought Ahab, is sordidness. Granting that the white whale fully incites the hearts of this my savage crew, and playing round their savageness even breeds a certain generous knight-errantism in them, still, while for the love of it they give chase to Moby Dick, they must also have food for their more common daily appetites. For even the high-lifted and chivalric crusaders of old times were not content to traverse 2,000 miles of land to fight for their holy sepulchre without committing burglaries, picking pockets, and gaining other pious perquisites by the way. Had they been strictly held to their one final and romantic object, that final and romantic object too many would have turned from in disgust. And will not strip these men, thought Ahab, of all copes. I will not strip these men, thought Ahab, of all hopes of cash. Aye, cash. They may scorn cash now, but let some months go by and no prospective promise of it to them, and then this same quiescent, I gotta look that up. Quiescent. I've always got to do that. Herman Melville, man, he is a crazy person when it comes to vocabulary. All right. Quiescent. And gaining other pious that wasn't it. Okay, no. And then this same quiescent cash, all at once mutinying in them, this same cash would soon cashier Ahab. Nor was there wanting still another precautionary motive more related to Ahab personally. Having impulsively, it is probable, and perhaps somewhat prematurely revealed the prime but private purpose of the Pequod's voyage, Ahab was now entirely conscious that, in so doing, he had indirectly laid himself open to the unanswerable charge of usurpation, and with perfect impunity, both moral and legal, his crew, if so disposed, and to that end competent, could refuse all further obedience to him, and even violently wrest from him the command. From even the barely hinted imputation of usurpation and the possible consequences of such a suppressed impression gaining ground, Ahab must, of course, have been most anxious to protect himself. That protection could only consist in his own predominating brain and heart and hand, backed by a heedful, closely calculating attention to every minute atmospheric influence which it was possible for his crew to be subjected to. For all these reasons, then, and others, perhaps too analytic to be verbally developed here, Ahab plainly saw that he must still, in a good degree, continue true to the natural, nominal purpose of the Pequod's voyage. observe all customary usages, and not only that, but force himself to evince all his well-known passionate interest in the general pursuit of his profession. Be all this as it may, his voice was now often heard hailing the three mastheads and admonishing them to keep a bright lookout and not omit reporting even a porpoise. This vigilance was not long without reward. It's the end of 46, and we are at chapter 47, The Mat Maker. It was a cloudy, sultry afternoon. The seamen were lazily lounging about the decks or vacantly gazing over into the lead-colored waters. Queequeg and I were mildly employed weaving what is called a sword mat for an additional lashing to our boat. So still and subdued and yet somehow preluding was all the scene, and such an incantation of revelry lurked in the air, that each silent sailor seemed resolved into his own invisible self. I was the attendant or page of Queequeg while busy at the mat. As I kept passing and repassing the filling or woof of marline between the long yarns of the warp, using my own hand for the shuttle, and as Queequeg, standing sideways, ever and anon slid his heavy oaken sword between the threads, and idly looking off upon the water, carelessly and unthinkingly drove home every yarn. I say so strange a dreaminess did there then reign all over the ship and all over the sea, only broken by the intermitting dull sound of the sword, that it seemed as if this were the loom of time, and I myself were a shuttle mechanically weaving away at the fates. There lay the fixed threads of the warp subject to but one single, ever-returning, ever-changing vibration, and that vibration merely enough to admit of the crosswise interblending of other threads with its own. This warp seemed necessity, and here, thought I, with my own hand I ply my own shuttle and weave my own destiny into these unalterable threads. Meantime, Queequeg's impulsive, indifferent sword, sometimes hitting the woof slantingly or crookedly or strongly or weakly, as the case might be, and by this difference in the concluding blow producing a corresponding contrast in the final aspect of the completed fabric. This savage's sword, thought I, which thus finally shapes and fashions both warp and woof, this easy and different sword must be chance. Chance, free will and necessity, wise incompatible, all interweavingly work together. The straight warp of necessity, not to be swerved from its ultimate course, its every alternating vibration, indeed, only tending to that, free will still free to ply her shuttle between given threads, and chance, though restrained in its play within the right lines of necessity, and sideways in its motions directed by free will, though thus prescribed to by both, chance by turns rules either, and has the last featuring blow at events. Thus we were weaving and weaving away when I started at a sound so strange, long drawn and musically wild and unearthly, that the ball of free will dropped from my hand, and I stood gazing up at the clouds whence that voice dropped like a wing. High aloft in the cross trees was that mad gay-header Tashtego. His body was reaching eagerly forward, his hand stretched out like a wand, and at brief sudden intervals he continued his cries. To be sure, the same sound was that very moment perhaps being heard all over the seas from hundreds of whalemen's lookouts perched as high in the air, but from few of those lungs could that accustomed old cry have derived such a marvelous cadence as from Tashtego, the Indians. As he stood hovering over you, half suspended in air, so wildly and eagerly peering towards the horizon, You would have thought him some prophet or seer, beholding the shadows of fate, and by those wild cries announcing their coming. There she blows! There she blows! She blows! Where away? On the lee beam, about 2 miles off, a school of 'em. Instantly, all was commotion. The sperm whale blows as a clock ticks. The sperm whale blows as a clock ticks with the same undeviating and reliable uniformity, and thereby whalemen distinguish this fish from other tribes of his genus. There go the flukes, was now the cry from Tashtego, and the whales disappeared. Quick, steward, cried Ahab. Time, time! Doughboy hurried below, glanced at the watch, and reported the exact minute to Ahab. The ship was now kept away from the wind, and she went gently rolling before it. Tashtego reported that the whales had gone down heading to leeward. We confidently looked to see them again directly in advance of our bows. For that singular craft at times evinced by the sperm whale when sounding with his head in one direction, he nevertheless, while concealed beneath the surface, mills around and swiftly swims off in the opposite quarter. This deceitfulness of his could not now be in action, for there was no reason to suppose that the fish seen by Tashtego had been in any way alarmed, or indeed knew at all of our vicinity. One of the men selected for the shipkeepers, that is, those not appointed to the boats, by this time relieved the Indian at the masthead head. For there was no reason to suppose that the fish, by this time relieved the Indian at the mainmast head. The sailors at the fore and mizzen had come down. The line tubs were fixed in their places. The cranes were thrust out. The mainyard was backed, and the 3 boats swung over the sea like 3 samphire baskets over high cliffs. Outside of the bulwarks, their eager crews with one hand clung to the rail, while one foot was expectantly poised on the gunwale. So looked the long line of man-o'-war's men about to throw themselves on board an enemy's ship. But at this critical instant, a sudden exclamation was heard that took every eye from the whale. With a start, all glared at dark Ahab, who was surrounded by 5 dusky phantoms that seemed fresh-formed out of air. That was chapter 47. All right, good deal. Well, we're making progress. We'll get them edited up and posted before too long. Thanks for watching, whether you're live or catching the replay. I'll talk to you later. Have a great night.